Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to an all new episode of Akash Talks. 100% raw, 100% pure, and 100% from the heart. This is your host Akash, and in today's episode, we're going to talk anything and everything about podcasts. Yes, you heard it right. Talking about a podcast on a podcast. I swear that sounds funny, sometimes at least. Okay, so before we dive into talking about today's topic, I'm recording this episode on the day of Thanksgiving. So, a very happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Let's all be thankful to whatever we have today. Okay, let's dive into today's topic, that is podcasts. I'm sure when you're listening to this at some point or the other, you have already heard to a podcast or have a vague idea of a podcast, or you actually know what a podcast is. But I'm sure this episode holds something for everyone. Whether you have heard to it or whether you are a pro in it, whatever in it, I'm sure there is something for everyone. So let's dive right in. There are three questioning words that intrigue the human mind whenever you listen to something new or whenever you come across a new topic. The three intriguing, questionable words, as you would have already imagined, is what, why, and how. So we're going to deal with today's topic, that is podcasts, with reference to these three words to make it more interesting. That is, what is a podcast, why to listen to a podcast, and how to listen to a podcast. And towards the end of the episode, since I have been listening to a lot of podcasts, like a lot, I've been listening to podcasts from the past 2.5, 3 years. But from the last 6 to 7 months, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts. So I have a few suggestions of what kind of podcasts are generally a suggestion of podcasts that I like, so that you can enjoy them, listen to them and enjoy them. So before that, let's come back to what, why, and how of podcasts. What is a podcast? Now, as I told you, would have already heard it. My memory of podcast dates back to the first generation iPhone that my dad had. It had this app called Podcasts, but I never knew what it did, or I didn't know how to use it or something like that. Now I miss that. Why didn't I hear it back then? So let's coming back to the answer to the question of what is a podcast. Okay, let me define it in simple words. A podcast is basically an audio program. It's just like a radio show or radio, but what is the difference between the two is you can subscribe to a podcast and listen to it whenever you like, which you cannot do with a radio. You can also download the podcast to your device and listen to it even when you don't have internet accessibility, that is your cellular data or Wi-Fi. Now, with the basics set right in, let's talk about the confusion between the most confused words, podcast and podcast episode. There's a lot of confusion around this. Let me explain it to you. A podcast is a series of episodes, and it refers as a whole. Podcast episode is just one recording from that entire podcast. What you're listening to now is a podcast episode from my podcast named Akash Talks. Well, that did sound like an intended promotion for a second, but I promise that wasn't intended to be so. Okay, to give you a clear idea, let me give you an example. Podcast is like a TV show which is made up of a lot of episodes, a series of episodes. Each of the episode is called a podcast episode, and all the series together combined form a podcast. So Think of Friends as a series and the one where they got married as the episode. I know if you're not a Friends fan, you won't connect with it, but I think you get the whole idea. Okay, coming back to the example, in this case, Friends is the equivalent of a podcast, and the episode where they got married is the podcast episode. So that is what a podcast is. Basically, it's just an audio file which you can subscribe to and listen to, download it onto your device and listen to whenever you want. It is basically like radio, but the only difference is you cannot download or subscribe to a radio, but you can to a podcast. Next, moving on to the next intriguing question. Why? First and foremost reason, as you would have already guessed, the most basic one is entertainment. Podcasts are a very good way of entertainment. First of all, they are free. That is, you don't have to pay a cent. Unlike your other types, that is audiobooks, in which an author narrates a story, podcast is generally consists of a conversation between two or more individuals, sometimes one, as in this case. That back and forth has a lot of advantages over the typical one-person narration found in the books or a tape. A conversation often feels more natural than someone telling you a story. Okay, you get to hear people bounce off each other and build off what others said. It goes way natural. And a podcast isn't as structured as a book or a radio show, so it has more opportunities for interesting tangents and divergences that make listening more unpredictable. That is what the difference is between an audiobook, radio, and a structured show and the podcast. Yes, there are some structured podcasts as well, but I hope you get the idea. Okay, now moving on to why, the next point. Okay, we do a lot of tasks. Okay, during the day, there are a number of tasks that don't require a lot of memory usage or brain power, such as when you're working out or you're cleaning the house. It's usual, you're just cleaning or you're working out your regular whatever you have set. Okay, podcasts are a great way to help pass the time during those chores that you're doing, letting you immerse yourself into an enlightening conversation that can add some value as well. Okay, that's very good thing. Suppose you're listening to some good podcast of say a startup or something that is teaching values from a saint like Sadhguru or anyone. I'm just taking examples here, but you get to learn something while you're doing something else. That's actually very good. Moving on, podcasts aren't only good entertainment, but also great education, as I tried to say earlier. So the time you'd normally spend doing those mindless chores or exercising can be used to help you prepare for the next phase of your career or anything for that matter. There are a ton of shows out there that teach you or imbibe with your specific value on specific field or career path or field of study. So with that, wrapping everything up, podcasts provide you with free entertainment. Podcasts educate you in many fields with the startup knowledge and all that. Podcasts can help get less bored with your music library. Trust me, this is one of the most important points. Initially, when I started listening to podcasts, I was very reluctant to listen to podcasts because I had music, right? I'm like, whoa, any day music goes way above podcasts, which I was wrong. Podcasts are actually better than music. For various reasons, you might not go with me in this, but as you go on listening to the podcasts, you will come to a conclusion. So you might have tons of songs in your music library, but that gets boring with over time. So podcasts, it's always something new or something new episode coming up. So that takes out your boredom. With that, we got an answer as to why, to the question of why to listen to the podcast. Now the final and the most important one, how to listen to a podcast. How? It's important, right? Because after listening to what is a podcast and why to listen to a podcast, you definitely would want to try to listen to a podcast. So how do you do it? It's pretty simple, no rocket science, and it is completely free. Let me reiterate, it is completely free. You don't have to pay a single penny. You can listen to podcasts on various applications that are already present, such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. There is Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Republic, many. There are a hell lot of services out there. You can select the one that you like or that you're comfortable with. So you basically just choose your desired application or service, whatever you want to call it, and then search for a podcast that you want to listen to. Or if you're not sure what you want to listen to, or if you're listening for the first time, you can check out the top podcast lists and or the top podcast episodes, and then select the one that you want to listen, you want to try to listen to, and then boom, just play it and start listening to the podcast. Now, the next important question. You might be thinking on which app or which service to use to stream a podcast or download a podcast, because I've told there are a hell lot of services, and generally there will be one better compared to the other services. Yes, according to me, the best service until at least today exists. The answer to which depends on what device you use. So there are two main classification of devices: Android devices and Apple devices. So if you're using an Android device, according to me, Google Podcasts is the best you get. Yes, there are a lot of debatable question between Google Podcasts and Spotify, but for me, the user experience, the overall service is just, I feel it better with Google Podcasts. If you're using an Apple device, an iPhone, an iPad or anything from Apple, the stock Apple Podcasts app is the best. If you ask me between the two, I say Apple Podcast is the best, because it is just too good compared with the Google Podcast or any other app in terms of user experience. Again, Spotify is good as well, but Google Podcasts just feels better, to me at least, compared to Spotify. So all these answers are coming from me after using almost all the services that I mentioned. Yeah, I have used Google Podcast, I've used Stitcher, I've used Radio Public, I've used almost all the services. Like, I've tried all the majority of the services that are present. So I've played around almost all the apps, and the ones that I recommended are the best to use if you're starting off, or whether you're just confused what to select among all the services present. So yeah, if you're using an Android device, go for Google Podcasts. If you're using an Apple device, go for Apple Podcasts. Now, let's talk about the most interesting and the last part of the episode. This is going to be interesting because I have been listening to podcasts. Let me tell you my podcast story. How did I get into podcasts? Well, when we date back, say 5 or 6 years now, I never knew what a podcast was. Yes, as I told you vaguely, I remember that app from my dad's iPhone, or I would have read it somewhere in the net or something like that, but I never actually knew what a podcast was. So the story goes like this, because in every podcast, Akash has to have a story. So the trend continues. Yes, the trend continues. This is an interesting story, so listen to it. Here it goes. Me and my cousin were traveling in a car to Mysore. It's a place in Karnataka, if you don't know. Yeah, so we were going in a car and we were just talking stuff, and I was trying to hook up my phone to the car to play some music. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, Prajwal, that is my cousin, or Praju as I call him, he just pops up with this question as, dude, do you listen to podcasts? I'm like, yeah, I've heard them, but I might have listened to one, to keep that thing alive. But yeah, sometimes I do listen. Why? What's the matter? It's like, when I drive, I just put on a podcast and listen to it. It's just too good. You should listen to. Let's listen to a podcast. And that was my first full podcast that I listened to. I still remember the episode. It was the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, and the episode we listened to was from Dan Bilzerian. If you don't know Dan Bilzerian, this guy is crazy. You gotta Google him. He's like the Instagram king, something of that sort. So Google him and know more about him. I can't tell any more about him. So that's what hooked me onto podcasts. From then, after I completely listened to that podcast, I was in love with the whole concept of, podcasting, talking with people, listening to their conversations, because conversations hit you on another level and you connect with it a lot sometimes, not all the times, but I hope you get the point. So that's when I started to listen to podcasts. After that, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts, and recently, once the lockdown got initiated, I've listened to a lot of podcasts. So I have a few recommendations. Okay, for the suggestion, this is just on my personal recommendation that I have listened to and I like the podcast. You might like it, just give it a listen because these are one of the best that I have listened to. So there is 80 to 90% chance that you might like it. Some of the podcasts that I suggest actually hit the top podcasts of all time. When I was just googling about all the top podcast shows and stuff, I found many of the recommendations that I had hit on that list. So yeah, so let's get into the first suggestion that I have. Are you ready? 3, 2, 1. That was a bit too hype, right? Hyped up. Okay, the first suggestion is The Daily. THEDAILY, The Daily. This is a very interesting one. It's a news podcast in general, and it is by the well-known American newspaper, the New York Times. So it is basically a news podcast. They have daily episodes of 20 minutes, and by daily I mean 5 working days of the week, and they cover the daily news so that you get up to date with whatever is happening around you. Yes. Moving on to the next one. This one is from India. It's an Indian show, and it is one of the best that I've heard till date. A value adding podcast that I like to call it. It's called The Ranveer Show. I'm pretty sure you would have heard Ranveer Allahabadia somewhere or the other. If you are into YouTube, you might have heard his name. He is a very talented young man, and this comes from him, Ranveer Allahabadia. He's also known as Beer Biceps. Yes, that's his YouTube channel as well. Okay, the podcast is designed to bring the listeners some kind of value add with every episode. So it's designed in such a way. The podcast description reads as follows. We deep dive into some of the world's most intelligent, most successful minds in order to mine out the diamonds they've created over the course of their lives. Whoa. It actually is pretty interesting, and he has some amazing guests onto the show. There was Priyanka Chopra that I listened to. So many good, amazing people are there. You should definitely listen to it. It's a very good one. Okay, the third suggestion is On Purpose with Jay Shetty. Well, Jay Shetty is a very interesting man. If you haven't already heard about him, he is an Indian British author. He is also a former monk and a purpose coach. The podcast On Purpose with Jay Shetty, again from Jay Shetty, brings fascinating conversations with some of the most insightful people in the world straight to the viewers from all over the world. Again, he has some amazing guests. Featured guests include Kobe Bryant, Khloe Kardashian, Alicia Keys, among others. You're gonna love this one, trust me. Do give it a listen. Making things more curious and interesting, the next podcast suggestion is a crime-based podcast called Khuni, The Crimes of India. Ooh, that's a deep name. The show is hosted by 2 Indian lawyers, and these 2 girls, every week, they try to navigate the murky waters of true crimes in India. It's a very good show, and it's personally one of my favorite shows. It's an amazing show. I just love the way they narrate the story. It's a very interesting one. If you like crime stories, you're gonna love this one for sure. They have covered very interesting stories such as that of Veerappan, Charles Shobraj, and many more. It's very interesting. You gotta listen to this one. That was Khuni, The Crimes of India. Keeping the crime genre alive, next one is in the same category. It's called The Serial. Again, this is one of the all-time top podcasts, as Google says. Serial is an investigative journalism podcast. That is when you start investigating into something very deeply. And this podcast narrates a non-fiction story over multiple of episodes. It's a very good one. You gotta listen to this one. It's again in the crime genre. Personally, I don't know why, but I love to listen to these crime genre podcasts. The way the story is being narrated, it's just so good. It beats crime movies anytime, any day. Personally, for me at least. Okay, the next suggestion is the 80,000 Hours podcast. It is 80,000 Hours podcast. It is about how to use your career to make a difference in the world. It's very interesting because at the end of the day, you got to do something good to what has done good to you. Check it out. For all the travel enthusiasts out there, here are a few shows that you're gonna love or enjoy for sure. First one's called the Musafir Stories. It is about various Indian travel destinations. Guys, we live in a country called Incredible India. It is for a reason. It's an interesting one. Do check it out. There are very few good episodes. A way to lay, and it's amazing. Gotta listen to this one. Next one is called Zero to Travel. Well, if your ears are after something a bit more esoteric, Jason from Zero to Travel regularly digs down into the basic questions as to what travel is, why do we do it, and how to make it better. Jason also throws in a few tips on offbeat travel methods, and there are episodes devoted to answering listener questions. And you've got an inspiring mix for the train commute home. So those two are the two travel podcasts that you're going to enjoy. Now, moving on to the tech topic. Personally, there are a lot of tech podcasts that I discovered, but I personally like these two the most. One, as you can expect, is from Marcus Brownlee. If you don't know Marcus Brownlee, oh my god, MKBHD. I'm sure you would have seen him one point or the other on YouTube if you generally or at some point of time checked out any product review or unboxing or stuff like that, tech stuff basically. So it's called the Waveform Podcast and it comes from Marcus Brownlee. It's a very good one. Do check it out. The next one is called the Gadgets 360 Show. Again, a very good podcast. And I love their conversation style between the hosts. So those are the two tech podcast recommendations from me. So those were a few podcast recommendations that I'm sure you're gonna love because I truly loved them and I always listen to all the new episodes from all the podcasts. So you're gonna love it. So do give it a listen. So time to close this episode. But before that, I hope you got to know what a podcast is, why to listen to a podcast, and how to listen to a podcast. Well, if you already knew all these, I'm sure you're gonna love the podcast recommendations that I recommended. So with that said, time to close this episode. But before that, if you have any queries regarding anything, you can always connect me on all social media profiles, the links to which are given in the show notes. So do give it a check. Also, if you don't already know, I'm a vlogger. I vlog on my YouTube channel, the link to which is again given in the show notes. Do check it out. And please, if you like this podcast, rate the podcast, review the podcast. It just helps other audiences to discover the podcast more easily. So with that said, time to close this episode. I'm saying this for the second time, but I have one last point to make. So, well, now you've understood what a podcast is, and if you're interested in making a podcast, I'm going to talk about how to create your own podcast freely, that is without paying any penny to anyone. So next episode is going to be on that. So keep tuned in. Hopefully by tomorrow the episode is going to be out on how to create your own podcast and distribute it to all the major streaming platforms. So it's going to be an interesting one. And this week is pretty interesting because I have got a lot of episodes lined up, interesting episodes. So stay tuned. See you in the next one. Until then, take care, stay safe, have fun,